No, they're both. They're- So welcome. Thanks to all of you who managed to turn your clocks back. But today is November 3rd, and it was on this date in 753 that Parmenius died. I know, Parmenius died. Parmenius was one of the early church leaders, and it's in his writings that we have the first reference to what we call the Apostles' Creed. Now, we talked about the Nicene Creed and all that, but Parmenius was the one who brought us the Apostles' Creed. But in 1534, the English Act of Supremacy was passed. This is what created what is now referred to as the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, or in the U.S., the Episcopalian Church, although it's not 100% linked, because there are Anglican churches in Illinois. There's one in Bolingbrook, and there are Episcopalian churches. Yeah, the English Act of Supremacy passed, and it was one of the things. It was the end of the Catholic Church in England for a long period of time. Well, at least, in the open. It's one of the interesting stories of history is, how the Catholic Church continued in England. And, if you watch any of these old house shows from England, they'll show these, I forget what they call them, pastors' holes, pastors' hideouts, at these little weird little things where they would keep the Catholic priest in there when he came around. But that was in 1534. In 1783, George Washington disbanded the Continental Army. He disbanded the Continental Army, which you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, see, that was one of the big deals about George Washington, is that he walked away from things. Okay, when Washington, when the it was a civil war, but when the Revolutionary War ended, there were many people who thought that Washington, as the head of the army, would march his way to, I guess it was New York at the time, maybe Philadelphia, I forget which one was the capital, but and take control of the country. So he's the head of the army, he won the war, he was a very visible person, and he did not. He walked away and said, no, I'm done, kind of thing. And so that was one of the things that, whoa, something's different about this guy. And then when he became the president later, the fact that he walked away after 2 terms, he said, no, that's it, I'm done, and walked away. Again, that set the precedent for 160 years, 40 years, 60 years, until Roosevelt came along, FDR, and said, you know what, I don't have to walk away, I can stay. But that was something about Washington, that he walked away. He could say no to power. Not many people can do that, and that's one of the interesting themes that comes out of Samuel, talking about the role of power. When the king has power or not. In 1817, the first permanent bank in British North America was founded. Does anybody know what it was? The Bank of Montreal, better known as BMO, BMO Harris, BMO, Bank of Montreal. That's what it is. So yeah, that's how long that, whatever, I don't, it's merged so many times. Is it still BMO? Yeah, it's not just BMO. It was BMO Harris. Then it was, I know, my bank account hasn't moved for 27 years, but I've had like 4 different banks. Like, okay, do the checks still cash? Yeah, okay, I'm good, kind of thing. But that was in 1817. In 1956 was the first time that the Wizard of Oz was televised. And how many of you grew up looking forward every year to seeing the Wizard of Oz? Once, was it around Halloween that they would play the Wizard of Oz? I don't remember, but once a year, the Wizard of Oz would be played on TV, and that was the bomb. That was the thing. That was the thing to do. And speaking of presidencies, it was just interesting. It was on this date in 1983. One of my favorite candidates announced his candidacy for the presidency, Jesse Jackson. Does anybody remember Jesse Jackson running for president? That was he shook things up when he ran for the presidency, in similar ways that other current candidates have shaken things up in a number of ways, but he's still alive. You know, he's 80, 90 years old. I think he's 90 years old. Yeah, yeah, but he's still around. They just did a big thing for him in Chicago. Um, big some sort of celebration. I think Operation Push or the Rainbow Coalition, one of those two, has celebrated an anniversary, and he was there. But he announced his presidency. So I always get a kick out of listening to Jesse Jackson speak. He was kind of, you know, it was great fun. Okay, today we're in 1 Samuel chapter 13. At first, I told Debbie, I want to really cover some serious ground today. I wanted to cover 3 chapters. And that idea went nowhere. Just started going through and thinking, okay, I need to make a point about this. I need to make a point about that, and didn't. So the outline only goes 1 chapter, and if it turns out that I get finished, I can go on because the notes are in my Bible, so I'll just keep going. I'll give you a partially filled in handout next week. But if you recall, last week we talked about 1 Samuel 12, a pivotal chapter in the story of Samuel, in the story of the kingship, in the story of the history of Israel altogether, where the Samuel has brought, Saul has had this great victory, and Samuel, in the midst of this celebration, Samuel stands up at the end and says, "Listen, I want to remind you what a mistake you guys made." And he explains why it's made a huge mistake. And he says, but if you and your king remain under the covenant, do what you're supposed to do, the Lord is going to continue to bless you. Okay, so the Lord has given you this, but the Lord isn't going anywhere. You're the ones that are changing. It kind of reminds me of the old joke about maybe you've heard it, the man and the wife. Now, this is back. You remember cars that had bench seats in the front? And the guy would be driving and the girl would slide over, kind of thing. And so a husband and wife are driving along, and she's over on her side and he's on his side, and she says to him, "Why don't we drive together anymore like we used to, sitting close to each other when we drive?" And his response is, "Well, the steering wheel hasn't moved," kind of thing. And so you have to think of a bench seat for that to make sense, kind of thing. But it's kind of like, God isn't moving. You're the ones that are changing. But if you continue, then we'll be okay. Things will be all right. And he ends, and he gives this great part of encouragement. The Lord is still here. I'm still going to pray for you. I'm still going to be supporting you. You're still God's chosen people. So there's kind of ending on this great upward moment until at the end of chapter 12, he says, "But yet," verse 25, "if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish." His final line is, by the way, this is all great, but you still, if you and your king, and again, Saul is right there while he's telling this whole story. He's going through and he's telling this whole story with Saul right there. So now we're moving into 1 Samuel 13, and over the next couple of chapters, 2-3 chapters, we have Saul's fall from grace. I'm just calling it that. It just Saul's fall just seemed too short. There's a series of events that occur that explain kind of why Saul loses his position, so to speak. And keep in mind that the book of Samuel is written long after the kingship, okay, or maybe not long after the kingship. It's written at its earliest. It's written near the end of the life of David. At its earliest, okay. It included writings. It included other narratives. I mean, we talked about the Ark narrative as being something that might have been written separately that was kind of incorporated into the text. and clearly one of the explanations, one of the reasons for writing the book, it wasn't written, and in fact, history books today aren't written just to tell you the story. Okay, I mean, people want you to think that, but when you read a history book, it isn't just no history book. I was a history major; I had to go through historiography and all that stuff. It's like no history is written just to tell you a story. Okay, any historian who writes a story wants you to draw some conclusion from, maybe it's just that this guy is a good guy or this guy is a rat or whatever kind of thing. But usually it's like, this is the cause of that, and you can explain this because of that. And so one of the things that this book is going to be very focused on is why Saul is not the king. Okay, so it's going to focus on the negative things that Saul does. It doesn't necessarily say a lot of good things about David, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that when we get to David. I don't want to jump ahead, although I want to, but I'm focus. Okay, focus. All right, Samuel chapter 13 starts with a timeline, which is not without its problems. Okay, and again, this is getting into, verse 1. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Okay. Now, I say that because, again, the chronologies in the Old Testament, and the New Testament for that matter, are not as tight as, a history written in 2024 would be. Okay, and it's just the level of exactitude isn't as important, or just they didn't know. I mean, they didn't have calendars to this extent that, and the record keeping that we have today, and all of these, electronic footprints and things, and CCTVs keeping track of where you were on the night of August 13th, kind of stuff. Okay, and I say that so it's like, so there's different textual support for different numbers here as far as how old Saul was, how long he was the king. Okay, so in Acts chapter 13, Paul says that Saul was the king for 40 years. So we have a contradiction. There you go. That's it. We're done. I've proven a contradiction. I'm out of here. See you later. So is it a contradiction? No, not really. I mean, because neither one of them pretends to be giving you a statistical study of each year of the life of Paul. He was 40 years, 2 generations, 42 years. One text, if you have an NIV, you've got some notes there that says, one says that he reigned over Israel 2 years. Okay, so it's like, okay, well, clearly a lot happened in that 2 years if that's the case. And then Paul comes up in Acts chapter 13 again. It says, well, Saul was the king for 40 years. So somebody later on said, well, let's just put them together and call it 42 years. So again, and the stories themselves are not necessary. It isn't that they went, the end of chapter 12, they went to this great party, this great celebration, and then they turned around and the Acts chapter 13 happened. Or I'm sorry, 1 Samuel 13 happens. Okay, so again, it's selective in terms of what they're talking about. And so there's some differences in terms of, somebody, come on. We can't talk about Marty anymore, so he's here. We'll finish that later. You all know what I'm talking about right now. And it's kind of like the Gospels are selective. They're not exhaustive, and they're not necessarily in the same order as each other, because each writer has a particular point that he is trying to make. Okay? Yes?
This fascinates me. I have an RSV, and it reads, Saul was ... years old when he began to reign, and he reigned ... and 2 years over Israel.
Right.
And then the footnote says the number is lacking in Hebrew.
Okay.
Wow. So fill in the blank as you want.
So yeah. So probable reading. Again, the NIV says the probable reading of the original Hebrew text. Okay. So we don't know exactly. Again, to me, it's not a problem. I mean, if you want to really get super literal on your inerrancy arguments, well, good luck. But it's he was an adult, he was grown up, and we know that by the time chapter 13 starts, Saul has a son who is in turn old enough to lead an army into battle. Okay, so how old was Saul when he became king? How old do you have to be to lead an army into battle? Okay, so you kind of, I kind of think, well, at least 20, which means Saul is somewhere in the area of 40. So again, is this immediate? No, I think this is some time after. Saul has been king for a while, but again, I'm just, don't get too hung up on the dates and ages, he says, while getting hung up on the dates and ages here. Okay. So Saul reigns over Israel for 42 years. Okay. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their home. Okay, so now we have Saul's son has appeared, Saul's son Jonathan. Jonathan, okay. To me, Saul's son, Jonathan, is like the moral exemplar of the book of Samuel. I mean, the more I read this book, the worse I feel for Jonathan. Okay, because really, Jonathan does nothing wrong through the book. He's the only good son in the book. Okay, the only son of whom his father can say, "That's my boy," and I am, yes. Okay, I mean, Jonathan is the heir apparent. He is the Prince of Wales. He should be the next king of Israel. Okay, and yet he's the one that just says, "Okay, God wants you, David. I'm not going to fight it." He's the only one that submits to what's going on. He's the only one that there's no indication of any moral failings on his part, and he loses everything. I mean, he's killed in battle, supporting his dad, doing what he's supposed to do, kind of thing. It's like, we talk about a lot. I mean, there's a lot of sermons about, oh, you guys, be like David, because David was a man after God's own heart, and that's all great. But I'm like, be like Jonathan. I mean, Jonathan is the guy. He's, again, every time I feel sad for Jonathan. Oh, John, this isn't going to end well for you, kind of thing. You kind of want to reach back into the story and say, Jonathan, he's the one who takes the initiative. He's the one who is willing to protect his friends. He's the one who's willing to see God's will done in the book. I just kind of have to say that. I like Jonathan. To me, Jonathan is the hero of Samuel. He's the one we should be looking at and going, wow, this is the guy, kind of thing. But all right, I said enough about Jonathan. But he's a great guy. So in chapter 3, verse 3, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, Geba. Okay, now there are a couple of different renditions of this, and again, another thing, place names are a little weird. Different spellings, different things like that. Even in U.S. history, if you go back and read something written in the 18th century, and they talk about different place names, you'll see different spellings and different. So there are some who argue that this is Gibeah. Geba, Geba, is the same as Gibeah, Gibeah, and he's going to go attack an outpost at Gibeah. Now, does that sound familiar to anyone? Does anybody remember this outpost? See, when Saul was first told you're going to be the king, he said, you're going to leave. Samuel says, you're going to leave here, and you're going to meet people with food, and they're going to give you food, and you're going to meet people. Somebody, you're going to meet somebody who's going to tell you where the donkeys are. You're going to meet people with food. They're going to give you food. Then you're going to meet a group of prophets coming back from Gibeah, which, by the way, is where a Philistine outpost is. And the question is, Samuel says to Saul there in 1 Samuel 10, I think it is, he says, do whatever your heart feels like doing, or something along that line. Do whatever you're led to do. And the question is, was Saul supposed to attack that Philistine outpost? Was he supposed to take the bull by the horns and thought how much different it would have been had he done so? Okay, now again, this is speculation. It's not in the text. There's nothing that says he should have. It's just sort of like, well, why does Samuel make the point of saying there's a Philistine outpost there? You're going to be the king. The desire of Israel is upon you. By the way, there's a Philistine outpost over there, kind of thing. I just it's an interesting speculation. But here, several years later, here's Saul's son going to go take out this outpost at Gibeah, an outpost. Let's just say it is an outpost. Okay, the text doesn't support that it's the same one. I just think it's an interesting speculation to hear. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Okay. So in 13, let's see, I say Saul's son Jonathan is the moral exemplar of the book of Samuel. In 13:3, Jonathan attacks the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and then go back to 10:5. Okay. The Philistines heard about it. I don't know, maybe they saw it on Yahoo or something. I don't, blows up. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So Saul hears about it as well. So all the Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Okay, so again, Jonathan it does whatever he does at this outpost. Okay, now again, we're going to have another story where he wipes out another outpost. So I'm guessing he does another thorough job here, so much so that the Philistines hear about this and go, "Hey, we got to do something." Okay, it's big enough that they have this large a response. We've got to do something about these Hebrews. Okay, and so then the message goes out, and it's interesting. Side note: the message goes out. Who attacked the outpost? The message. What does the message say? Saul. Who actually attacked the outpost? Jonathan. Now Saul's the leader, and Jonathan is his son. He's acting so okay. Just noticing it, kind of interesting. And so Saul gathers the troops. Okay, he gathers the troops. Okay, Saul is attacked and has become obnoxious to the Philistines. Not to be outdone, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel. Okay, now this is interesting because if you remember from chapter 7, that during Samuel's reign, the Philistines had been kept at bay. The Lord's hand was against the Philistines. Okay, so during Samuel's reign, the Philistines had not been able to succeed in an attack. Well, Samuel's reign is over in that this is part of why the king. Samuel, you're old and gray and your kids aren't doing it. We want a king. Okay, and so now Samuel's reign is over. Here come the Philistines, and they do a massive response. Okay, so this, again, they're throwing some numbers here, but this is a huge, huge response. Okay, the largest chariot army up until this point is like 1,700, and here the Philistines are showing up with 3,000 chariots. So this is a huge response. Okay, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. Okay, so the Philistines are ready. They've been held back for years, and they want to make a point here. They want to do away with this Israelite threat. Apparently, their leader is gone. This new king, what is he? We don't care whether they know about it or not. It's like we're going to do something about this. So you imagine the situation, okay? So you've got Saul there. He's blown he sent the message out. Okay, so I don't know whether he's killing more oxen and sending more bloody meat out anymore, but there's no indication that he does that. But he sends a message out, and the Israelites start to come in, start to assemble. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Okay, now this is not a good thing. Okay, they're not settling in for like a guerrilla warfare thing. Okay, I mean these guys are. Whoa, wait a minute. There's a lot of them. Okay, I mean it's kind of a. You can imagine the scene where you've got a small band of raiders with you, and you come over the hill and you see an army of thousands. Okay, I can imagine that being a little demoralizing. Okay, Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So they literally bail out of here. I'm gonna, they went to Canada, kind of thing. All right, they got to get out of here. I don't want to be anywhere around when this battle takes place. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. This blows up, and I mean it's just the message blows up. I guess after I printed it, I realized blows up is not really the right word to use to describe. So I could have just reprinted all 15 of the handouts, but then that's more ink, and so. But this blows up. The message blows up. Saul gets the call, and the Israelites are summoned to Gilgal. The Philistines held back for years, bring up a massive army. Many of the the Israelites hid in response to the upcoming battle, and others were quaking in fear. Okay, where's that? Well, that comes out later. Saul is going to describe it. Verse 7. Some Hebrews even. Oh, there it is. My text, the NIV I've got has it split. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. Okay, so this is not a super confident army right here. Okay, some of them were quaking in fear. Okay. Saul remained at Gilgal, and the troops there. Okay, Saul knows how this needs to go. Okay, they need to get the Lord's blessing in order to ensure that they're going to have victory. Okay, he wants to get the Lord's blessing here. Okay, so it's okay, guys. So he's got. Now imagine his situation. Okay, so again, we like to pick on Saul here, but I mean, think about his situation. I mean, they've got this massive army out there, right? That's got chariots and and your guys are hiding behind trees and in holes and running that way, quaking in fear. And you're going, listen, we're going to get the sacrifice. Once we get the sacrifice, we're going to go and the Lord's going to bless us, right? So Saul is doing what he thinks he's supposed to do. He's supposed to be leading the Israelites into battle, protect them from their enemies. He's going, great, we got to get the Lord's blessing. This is a good thing, right? We got to get the Lord's blessing. We're going to wait for Samuel. Samuel's going to be here in 7 days, within 7 days, and then we're going to go do the battle. So he spends 7 days calming the people down, keeping them from running across the river, trying to keep his soldiers, okay, we're going to, it'll be 7 days. So we get to the end of the 7th day, no Samuel. Okay. Saul wants the Lord's blessing. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So the ones that were quaking in fear are suddenly, listen, Saul, we love you, man. We love you. We voted for you, but we're out the door. Okay. So it's like, you guys may not have noticed this, but there's an election coming up. Has anybody seen anything about that? There's an election coming up. Yeah. Tuesday, I think. And here's the thing. Someone is going to win the election. Okay. And whoever that someone is, and this happens every election, so it's not party specific, but that person is going to do something probably very soon that's going to alienate the so-called people who put him or her in the office. And then suddenly you're going to see this whole thing. We loved you, we voted for you, but I should have voted for the other side. Okay, I was telling Debbie about this. One of my favorite weeks in politics, in the world of politics, was Bill Clinton's first week in office. Does anybody remember those glory days? That glorious first week of January 20th, 27th, 1993, I want to say it was. Bill Clinton gets into office, and he alienated everybody in like the first 7 days he was in office. It was great. It was just like, there was so much angst in the air. He ran campaign, said, I'm going to support this. He gets in office 3 days and said, I don't think so. He said, I'm going to support that. Said, no, not exactly. It was great fun. And I'm predicting, it doesn't matter who wins, that same thing is going to happen. The first week in January is going to be a riot because whoever it is going to disappoint whoever put him there. But focus. Debbie's giving me the focus sign. Back to the text kind of thing. So, so Saul is there, right? And his men are quaking in fear, and now suddenly they're leaving. And what's the guy supposed to do? Okay, I mean, again, we just think about it as a question of a simple act of disobedience. Okay, and it is, but I mean, he's in a tough spot. Okay, so again, he's what happens if all of these guys leave? Okay, the Philistines are still there, and sooner or later they're going to attack. And who are they going to be looking for? Him. So his idea was, well, again, he didn't get any text messages from Samuel as far as why he was going to be late. No messages. All he knew is Samuel's not here. Samuel said he'd be here in 7 days. Somebody's got to take the lead. Somebody's got to take the initiative. Somebody's got to step up here and do what needs to be done. Right? That's how we put it today, right? So step in. Great initiative. You know what? How difficult can it be? You build an altar, you kill the animal, you pray. How difficult can it be? Okay. Probably not that difficult, as far as to do. Okay. So that's what he does. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Okay. Does he pray? Does he ask for the Lord's blessing kind of thing? Whatever. He just says, all right, I'm going to do this. Okay. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. And then it says he's praying over it, and he says, in Jesus' name or whatever, amen. Opens his eyes, looks over. Oh, Samuel, how you doing? How about it? How you doing? Kind of here. Kind of reminded. Does anybody remember another great political moment? You remember when Ronald Reagan was shot? There was a great press conference with Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of State at the time, where Haig was standing up there and going, "I'm in charge here. I'm in charge. I'm in charge," which is not true. He wasn't in charge. There was a vice president coming around there, and people. I don't think he ever recovered from that. I'm in charge now. Whenever you think of Alexander Haig or in the political, Alexander, I'm in charge here. Haig is kind of how he's. Kind of stepped in, took over a situation that he really didn't need to take over. So again, he decides to take over, and Samuel arrives, and Saul went out to greet him. Now, one of the things that I noticed about Saul here, again, he's a talker, or he kind of understands the game, so to speak. That's not quite the right word, but I mean, there's times where he's got an explanation. He's got an explanation why. Okay, and Samuel's first word, what have you done? Have you ever met someone who greeted you with those statements? That's not a positive, right? You're doing something and your parents walk in and they say, what have you done? Or your kid comes home and you had to ask that question of your kid, what have you done? What have you done? Okay, this is not a well done, thou good and faithful servant. This is what have you done kind of thing. Now, granted, we don't have the tone. It could be a more positive, kind of, like, where are you at this point? And, what have you done? What have you done so far? I don't think so. Based on what Samuel says, finally, but he comes in, what have you done? So my goal in life is to never have anybody ask me, what have you done? Kind of thing. I'm working on it. I don't know that I've quite made it, but what have you done? Saul replied, and he gives him 3 reasons, right? He says in verse 11, when I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time. So Samuel, if you'd been here, yeah, so if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. Okay, you would. I thought, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering.
Mine says, I forced myself.
You forced my, okay. Force myself. Yeah, I like that. That's good. I felt compelled. I had to. I didn't have a choice. You weren't here. What was I supposed to do? What's a guy supposed to do in a situation like that? Okay. Now, I'm kind of wondering whether at the point whether Saul felt he was really accomplishing something, or when he was doing the offering or whatever kind of thing. Samuel doesn't really mince any words here. Verse 13, you have done a foolish thing. Now, the question here is, was this a test for Saul? I mean, yes, and was it a planned test for Saul? I mean, was Samuel just waiting over there, knowing he's going to show up 5 minutes after, 7 days, just seeing what Saul's going to do? I don't know. It just seems it's awfully convenient that as soon as he's done, here comes Samuel. Okay. Again, speculation, so you don't have to agree with me. The fact is, Saul shouldn't have done the offering. He takes on for himself a role that he was not given. Okay. He puts himself into a position vis-a-vis the people's relationship to the Lord that he was not authorized to take. Okay. He basically has replaced Samuel in his priest role. Okay, this is a foolish thing to do. Okay, now again, I don't think this is immediately after the previous chapter. I mean, I think this is several years down the road. So what has happened up until that point, I don't know. But just because, like we talked about, with the ages of the kids and all of that, so, but this is the first thing. And so Samuel says, Saul wants the Lord's blessing, which in turn says, Saul takes on the priest's role and offers the sacrifice. Just as he finishes, Samuel arrives. Was this a test? Did Saul pass? No, Saul didn't pass the test, if it was. Samuel's first words were, what have you done? Saul explains, but Samuel says, you have done a foolish thing. Okay, another sentence I don't want anybody ever to have to say to me. You have done a foolish thing. Although the Lord knows there are many things I have done where that could or should have been said to me. You have done a foolish thing. Per Samuel, Saul has failed to keep the command the Lord gave him. Okay, now what command is he talking about? Well, specifically, we don't know. Okay, I mean, again, it's not laid out that thou shalt not offer the burnt offering that explicitly. But clearly he's replaced Samuel's priestly role, and this was not a position he was authorized. I'm guessing this is something that is written in that document that was written in 1 Samuel 8 and stored in the temple or in the tabernacle, tent of meeting, whatever you want to call it, kind of thing. You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you remember when Saul first met with Samuel, they talked all night. And and they've talked again. I think this is well into his kingship, well into his experience there. You have not kept the command. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. Okay. It's like, you know what? So the more I read this, I think, I think this was kind of a test. I mean, it was a test, but was it a planned test? I mean, because again, I think Samuel, the Lord knew when the Philistines were going to attack, if they were going to attack at all. So that's really the thing. Saul is worried that the Philistines are going to attack any minute. Okay, the Lord knows when the Philistines are going to attack. Okay, so it's kind of, if you think about the story of Abraham and God negotiating over Lot, and kudos to Abraham for, why are you going to kill it for lack of 5 and 20? What about 20? What about 5 and 10? Kind of thing. I mean, the Lord always knew how many believers there were in there. So, the Lord always knew. So Samuel knew when the Philistines were going to attack. It could have been 14 days. It could have been a month. He knew. So at least the Lord knew, and the Lord and Samuel were tight. Okay, we know that, right? Excuse me. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Okay, this is not something that any king wants to hear. Okay, I mean, I have read enough history especially history of Britain is like when it comes to kings and things, and having a legacy becomes, having a kid that's going to be your not progenitor, no, pardon me, heir is a huge thing. Again, go back to Henry VIII. Why did he have 6 wives? Okay, because he needed a male heir, right? And out of 6 wives, he only managed to get 1 male heir out of that whole group, kind of thing, who became king and lived for 6 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever. But this is a huge thing. Okay, now, but here's the thing. Okay, what Samuel is telling Saul is kind of vague. Okay, I mean, it's not good, but it's conceivable that Saul could have said, where he says the Lord took somebody after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. Saul could think Jonathan, because who's the next king going to be? Jonathan. So maybe it could be, just thinking about it in the moment, could be saying it's not that the Saulide kingdom, as opposed to the Davidic kingdom, the Saulide, that's your church history word for the day, the Saulide kingdom, Saulide. The Saulide kingdom was going to stop. Like in England, it's not like the Lancasters were going to go away and the Yorks were going to take over. Maybe it's just, okay, you're not going to live. You're going to die. You're not going to be able to enjoy being the king. And your son, who certainly, fits the criteria based on what we've seen in the text of a man after God's heart, is going to be the king. Okay, that's not good news, but it's not terrible news. Okay, but that's speculating on my part, just kind of thinking through the story and what's going on at the time and how does this fit. And there's a cardinal on the bench back there. Anyone want to? So he says, Saul explains, but Samuel says, you have done a foolish thing. Per Samuel, Saul has failed to keep the command the Lord gave him. The command we don't know. But we know that Saul's kingdom would not endure. The Lord has already sought out a man after his own heart. And it says, and appointed him. Again, this is where the timeline gets a little weird, okay? Has Samuel already met with David? The text isn't clear. The text kind of makes us think that meeting comes later. Is the Lord's appointing just something that the Lord has done in his providence and said, okay, this is the guy, sort of stuff? We don't know. Could it be that Samuel was a few days late because he was over visiting Jesse's family? Okay, again, timeline not as tight as we would like to have it. But he says he picked out a man after, the Lord has already sought out a man after his own heart. Okay, now this phrase, this is you always hear this phrase whenever anybody talks about David. I mean, in contemporary society, you always hear this phrase. Now, the thing is, this phrase can have 2 meanings. Okay, and the 2 meanings could be, one, the meaning that we usually use when we talk about David, that David's heart was all out for God, and that's why God chose him. Okay, the Lord is ours. So the phrase could mean a man who had a heart for God. That is a definition. Oh, this is a guy who wants to do nothing but please me. Okay, and whenever people talk about David and they use it, that's the way they're using it oh, don't say bad things about David because he was a man after God's own heart. Okay, am I right? I mean, that's kind of what we mean when we say that. The side note that, and then this is just, this is not in your things. This is a description of David at this point in his life. Okay, just an observation, because there's kind of come some times you go, really, David, is that what a man after God's own heart would do? Okay, and I got to go, no. There's several things. We all think about Bathsheba, but there's a few other things that David does. Okay, David is not the saint that. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Focus. Back to Saul. The phrase could also mean it's a man that God chose. Whereas Saul was the king that the people wanted. Saul looked like the kind of king they wanted. Saul acted like the kind of king they wanted. Okay, you guys want a king? I'll give you the king you want. Here's the king you asked for. He's tall. He's handsome. Right? What more could you want in a king? Okay? And, when we use the phrase, this is what we mean. Okay? When I say, Paul Lundquist he's a guy after my own heart. Do I mean that Paul Lundquist lives all day to please me? No, because he doesn't. Do you? No.
Or
Okay.
does it mean I want to reach into your chest and rip out your
Well, yeah, Paul. It could be that. That is the third meaning. It is the third meaning. We use the phrase, oh yeah, he's a guy after my own heart. That means we like him. That's how we use the phrase, right? So to me, I'm thinking, okay, the message that this is my, you can disagree with me if you want, okay? But what Samuel is saying is like, okay, you were the people's choice. Now God has chosen somebody that's going to be the king. And that's what he means when he said man after God's own heart. Okay? Because David is by no means perfect. Okay? I mean, there are some interesting things that David does that result in some very bad situations. Thousands and thousands of people die because of David's moral failings. And I'm not just talking about Bathsheba. Okay? So it's like when we keep going, oh yeah, oh, but he was a great poet. Okay. I'll give it to you. He was. Thousands and thousands of people are still dead because of David's moral choices. Okay. So that's sort of my my diatribe here, and the whole idea that God's man after God's own heart. It's like, okay, that you guys seen the movie The Princess Bride, where it's I don't think that phrase means what you think it does, kind of thing. I think that's kind of like, I don't think that really, at one point in his life, David was a man after God's own heart. Okay, maybe again.
I appreciate your bringing that up
because I'm wrong, and now Paul is going to. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because I've just seen it so many times. I have known pastors and missionaries. I can think of a couple of missionaries or biblical Bible translators who are willing to give their lives to present the Bible to indigenous people, live for years in uncomfortable circumstances in the jungle, and now they're atheists, wholeheartedly opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So they were people after God's own heart, and they manifested that.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're anti-Christians. And so you can look at one period of a person's life and say, this is true of them. And then later on, it is definitely not true. But the Apostle Paul, the other way, he persecuted Christians.
Yeah.
But then he became a proclaimer of the gospel. So it is good to specify at what time in this person's lifeline are you referring to. And it also brings up the glory of serving God faithfully to the end of one's days without falling away. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay. So, and again, it's just one of these things that gets used a lot. I mean, I've been in an email conversation with some people this past week where King David is brought up as an example of why I should go one direction or another in the current presidential circus. Okay, always, the argument was, well, if you take that argument, that moral failings, you wouldn't have voted for King David. And I said, no, I wouldn't have. No, I don't think that's a slam dunk that you think it is. I know I wouldn't have, no question about it. But, again, we all know now, the question is not whether David should have been the king. The question of Samuel is not whether David should have been the king. The question of Samuel is whether they should have had a king in the first place. Okay, that's the question. Okay, and then as we get to David, I'm going to start with the argument that David is, under the circumstances, the best of a bad situation, but it's still a bad situation. Okay, it is not the situation, it is not the setup, it is not the arrangement that the Lord wanted for the people of Israel. Okay, but in our stubbornness, because we do the same thing, we said we want to do it this way. So, kind of stuff. But getting back. So then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin. Okay, and what's going on in Gibeah and Benjamin? Does anybody remember? 13:3, Jonathan's there, attacking a Philistine outpost around there. And Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Now, when Saul started, he had 2,000 men with him. Okay, so 1,400 of his men have wandered off. Okay, so again, that's a big drop. If you're in a church of 1,400 people and you come in next Sunday and there's only 600, somebody's going to notice. If you're going to go into battle and you got 1,400 men and you turn around and you realize, wait a minute, I only have 30% of what my force was. Okay, this isn't Gideon here. Okay, this is Saul. Oh, wait, this is not a good thing. Okay, so this kind of tells you this is how many people were bailing out on him. Okay, it wasn't one or two. This is a mass exodus that he's got dealing with it. So Saul and his son, verse 16, Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with him were staying at Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. So this whole thing is going on for quite some time, and you see this through Samuel, that these battles don't. It's not like they, like if you follow stories about the Civil War, these armies that are kind of floating around, and then they finally come into contact with each other, and then they all back off and go their way. Okay, and so we kind of think that that's how it is, but it's not. It's more like the First World War, where this army gets set here and this army gets set here, and they kind of sit there for a long period of time. Okay, when we're going to talk about David and Goliath, Goliath it's like 30 days. He's coming out there every day doing something. Okay, so again, was Saul in imminent danger of losing to the Philistines? Okay, were they going to attack? Okay, well, perhaps he thought so. I think he was just more worried that he's got people losing. Could he have waited another day? Yes. But regardless, Saul and his son Jonathan in Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth-horon, and the third toward the hinterland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Now, I know that means a lot to all of you, so I'll just kind of explain it here. The imminent battle shapes up around Gibeah with Saul and Jonathan and the Israelite army to the south and the Philistines to the north. Okay. In fact, the Philistine raiding parties ensure that access to the north was blocked. So they couldn't get to the north couldn't get to them. Okay. Now this is significant. This is significant because Saul's great victory, where his greatest supporters were in the north. Jabesh Gilead. Remember that huge battle where they're all in the north. So messages to the north might not get through. Reinforcements from the north might not get through. You've got this massive army here, but that's not all. There's another issue. Okay. Verse 19, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing gourds. Now, how this came about, I don't know. But the Philistines were able to get a huge technological advantage. They had swords. Okay, now that doesn't mean the Philistines couldn't, or the Israelites couldn't battle. They rocks and clubs and various other, spears that they could sharpen and arrows and things like that. So they clearly could do battle, and they clearly did. Okay, but when you're just holding that kind of weaponry and you look out and you see 3,000 chariots, with every one of them has a sword. As it is, the only people that have swords are Saul has one and Jonathan has one. You remember later on in the story, we're going to, David escapes. He doesn't have a sword, so he goes to the temple and he gets Goliath's sword because they're few and far between. So somehow the Philistines were able to gain this kind of economic control. I don't know. Again, we're just kind of given as a statement of fact, but it's just one more thing that makes the Philistines or make the Israelites quake in fear over this particular battle. Okay, so it's noted in 13 verses 19 through 21 that Israel was at a serious technical disadvantage. Okay, so on the day of the battle, not a soldier, verse 22. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Okay. Now, this would also explain why Saul was so eager to make sure that the Lord was with them. Okay, because, we don't have swords, we don't have spears. Okay, we better make sure the Lord is on our side before we get into this kind of thing. Just makes sense, right? But that's okay because Jonathan is going to save the day. Our man Jonathan is going to save the day, starting in the end of verse 23, but going into chapter 14, and we'll start that next week. So again, it's not looking good. Okay, Saul is on the outs with Samuel. He's done the wrong thing. He's at a technical disadvantage. He's at a numerical disadvantage. He doesn't know whether the Lord is going to bless this endeavor or not. What's going to happen? We'll find out next week.